You know what?
What makes a compelling story? The characters, the plot, the themes, maybe the setting? Life is Strange 2 found a very different answer to this question than its predecessor, so much so that a lot of controversy about the game sparked the moment it was released. Similar to the first entry in the series, the reception of the game was very divided, but this time the most visible split was among the series fans. Both sides could only agree that the game was either great or terrible. So, which one was it? Well, you probably already guessed my perspective from the video's title, but let's take a closer look at the game and its elements to see exactly what went wrong.
Hey. Hi. Thanks.
Meet the main protagonist and player character, Sean Diaz, a high school student and an older brother to Daniel, the protagonist of the story. Sean is an introspective and talented teenager. Unfortunately though, his character faces some issues. Sean, as the main protagonist of the game, is very bland. His entire personality is being a stereotypical teenager, while at the same time lacking any individual traits.
Dude, come on. That's a boulder, not a rock.
Sean is kind of in between everything in regards to character. He's nice but not too nice. He's neither really outgoing nor particularly shy. He's sort of artistic but not quite. Not too passive or assertive either. Add to that the stereotypical troubled teenager attitude. His one good quality is caring about his brother. Besides that, nothing about the character really stands out. He has neither good traits nor any significant flaws. This lack of an expression makes it hard to establish Sean as a genuine character, because due to an absence of individual traits, he doesn't feel like an actual representation of a real person. It comes without a surprise that the main protagonist is lacking in character development too, as aside from the attachment to his brother, Sean kind of stays the same for most of the game. The spotlight of character development is set on the sibling relationship between Sean and Daniel, and it doesn't seem Sean actually develops outside of that. Again, there's very little reason to develop if the character doesn't actually have any significant flaws, which could later be overcome. So, not only does the main protagonist start out uninteresting, he stays that way for the duration of the game. Some might describe Sean as plain boring, which he really kind of is. It's hard to take interest in his character because there's nothing special about him. Sean's whole personality is being a generic teenager and sacrificing for the sake of a somewhat unlikable brother. That's not enough to keep the player invested. He's also a very one-sided and linear character that doesn't seem to be any other layer to Sean than what he already is supposed to be. And I know the game jokes about it, but Sean really kind of is Daniel's babysitter, and a passive one at that. The whole game, the main protagonist will just go along with what Daniel wants, and mostly without any purpose for himself.
Fuck it. I'll come with you.
Sean makes for a very weak main protagonist and player character. That might be problematic, because if you dislike Sean as a character, there isn't a lot of other options to enjoy the game. As in Life is Strange 2's example, the game is concentrated almost solely on the two main characters and their relationship. It's very difficult to immerse yourself in the game's world when the player character isn't very interested in himself.
It's a really nice weather for a picnic.
Ultimately, Sean is a very basic and not a very memorable main protagonist. The lack of anything special makes it harder for the character to be likable, engaging, or frankly believable. It's not that Sean as the main protagonist is awfully bad, it's just that there really isn't anything distinctive about him, so the character could prove to be uninteresting and honestly quite boring.
You ate my Choco Crisp.
That's what big brothers are for.
Our sidekick Daniel is a 9 years old elementary school student and a younger brother to Sean. Daniel is a character gifted with telekinetic powers which come to life following the incident in Seattle. Throughout the story, he looks up to his older brother Sean, the player character and main protagonist, for guidance. As with his older brother, Daniel's character is no enigma, and I think that's mostly okay. His character is a typical resemblance of that 9 to 10 years old kid. It's the fact that he's a child that's a bit tricky, but more on that later on. Daniel is a young character faced with a great trauma and a challenge of having to grow up quickly. It's by no circumstance he often acts out or causes trouble. Daniel is an independent kid. Oftentimes he just won't listen to you.
I'm not listening.
You could even argue that he's quite aggressive. In moments of strong emotional distress, he'll lose control of his powers and cause trouble. In fact, Daniel will often make decisions and use his power independently of the player's choice. That's where the character gets tricky, not simply because the player has little to no control over Daniel's actions,
That kitten never listens.
but rather because the second main protagonist will be used very dishonestly as a plot device throughout the entire story. Daniel's special abilities combined with the character being a 9-year-old makes for a very strong plot device. He's actually the one moving the story of the game and not the player character, and he does so mostly in a way that creates trouble for the main protagonist.
Snooping around your living room.
No, I wasn't. I was just bored, so I came in.
This creates an unauthentic way to drag the player along with what the second main character does. You could influence him, but mostly in what he says and rarely in what he does. If you think about it, Daniel is actually the biggest obstacle on our journey. He creates problems which further the plot along, but the player has no agency over him.
He asked me for it.
I didn't force him, man.
It isn't simply an isolated case. Daniel makes multiple mistakes the entire game. The prime example of that being the entire episode 4, where Daniel just up and decides that after 3 seasons of not listening to his own brother, he'll listen to this random woman instead.
I'm sorry, Sean. She's right.
So, it's not that Daniel as a character is unlikable, it's the fact that he is a conceived plot device that's the problem.
You win.
And that leads us to the next point. Daniel is a responsibility, much more so than any other character. We, as the main protagonist, have to take care of him, which is unfortunate as we may simply not like the character, and we sadly may not get to like him throughout the story, due to his irritating nature, which is embodied by Daniel going out of his way to create trouble and never actually listening to the player character. I think a lot of people dislike him simply because it feels like he was forced on us. Unfortunately, if you dislike Daniel for any reason, he will be like a ball and chain attached to you throughout the game with no hope of escape. You'll be completely annoyed when he doesn't listen to you, and you certainly will be when you learn there isn't really an option to tell him off.
I know.
When he doesn't behave the way you'd want him to, you'd feel like banging your head against the wall. In the prequels, we are never responsible for other main characters the way we are responsible for Daniel. If you take a look at Telltale's The Walking Dead, Clementine's character is portrayed in a much more believable and likable way, as she's actually quite competent, which contrasts greatly with Daniel randomly screwing up because the plot demands so.
What do I want? Crazy.
Telekinesis, as used in the game, is the power to manipulate objects using one's mind. As it's our sidekick Daniel that's gifted, we as the main protagonist and Daniel's guardian have to guide him in how to use his powers. We can encourage or discourage Daniel to use them, resulting in different outcomes. In certain occasions we can ask Daniel to use his power, however he can refuse if he doesn't trust us enough, reflecting on the overall relationship between the siblings. Daniel's power should be limited by 2 factors, weight and distance of an object. In episode 2 it also seemed like line of sight came into play, but it doesn't look like that later on in the game. There is never any explanation as to how or why Daniel got his superpower abilities. Also, there doesn't seem to be any flavor to the power, as in the original game, special abilities were accompanied by an element of mystery or science fiction, along with a hint of ultimate purpose of those abilities. In Life is Strange 2, main characters just sort of accept them and move on.
Look what I can do, Sean.
One of the problems with Daniel's telekinetic abilities is the lack of the power's integrity. Possible to believe that Daniel's power really does grow fast, as evidenced many times throughout the game, but sometimes it's hard not to feel like Daniel is completely overpowered. That's especially true of episode 5, whether we look at Daniel taking on the whole police station by himself or some of the endings. Especially the fact that Daniel can create a kinetic barrier is surprising, as that comes completely out of nowhere. This lack of clear development and limits of his power hurts the story's integrity and makes it hard for the player to take the power seriously. One more issue is that the power isn't so well integrated with the game's plot. If you think about it, the events of the game happened because of Daniel's power or because people knew about it. Most of those events were used to provide us with an obstacle or set us back on our journey. Overall, it seems that the theme of escape is trumped by every single storyline being a direct result of Daniel's power, meaning the boys probably would have had an easier time escaping if Daniel didn't have his special abilities. It leaves us with an impression that the power wasn't actually needed in the story. Another issue is the type of power. If you look at Life is Strange 1, your power enabled you to explore all your choices as well as their immediate consequences, and opened many new dialogue interactions with other characters. That was very suitable for a game that focuses so heavily on storytelling. Not to mention it was an actual significant part of the game and the story. The new superpower just doesn't do that, or doesn't enable us to interact with the characters or the game's environment in any way. Telekinesis is far more suited for an action game. All things considered, the superpower ability was handled quite badly. The decision to take the power away from the player character ultimately led to some issues. From a gameplay point of view, it limits the interactions you can take with the game's environment. From a storytelling point of view, it gives us another layer of taking responsibility for Daniel, and from a strict plot point of view, it ultimately leads to an inauthentic depiction of choices and consequences in game, as player is forced both to rely and take responsibility for unclear rules of how Daniel is going to behave, and other times it's strictly a plot device to make the second main character do something stupid with which we as the main protagonist have to deal with. It just goes down to be frustrating.
Stop acting stupid. You're
Pretty amazing, huh?
The game's story is said to be told among 5 individual episodes, each starting after a few months of in-game time from the previous one. Every installment is a new experience with a new location's character, atmosphere and situation. This means that there is a possibility you can enjoy some episodes and dislike the others based solely on your preference. Life is Strange 2's setting is based on a road trip. It adds more dynamic to the game's now changing environment, but in practice it was executed very badly. Each episode you'll go to a place, stay there until certain events force you to move, then go to a new place and repeat. There's no overarching plot which would make those locations connected in storyline, so new places visited every episode seem random. Also, keep in mind that these new characters won't be present outside of that one particular episode. This episodic replacement of characters is taking a toll on the overall experience of the game. Such treatment of characters makes them overall less appealing, because there's so little time to get invested in their story. This especially hurts the side characters, as your relationship with them or the choices that you make concerning them will not make a difference in the end. In the original game, you could talk to a side character throughout several episodes and it would pay off in the end. That delayed gratification was genuinely rewarding. This means bad news for everybody, myself included, that like the wide plethora of interactions with other characters. Speaking of, the characters themselves aren't great either. A wide and changeable cast of characters means there's someone for everyone, but there isn't enough time to get attached to them. Another big issue is that the characters are very one-sided, meaning they'll either help you or hinder you during your journey, and while you'd expect your actions to play a bigger role in the decision, they only rarely do, and even then it leads to an irrelevant change. There's also very little character development among them. The characters start out the same and they'll end up the same. Most importantly, some of these characters just feel like they came straight out of a cartoon. Nowhere is it more evident than the antagonists of the game. It feels like they were essentially made villains for the sake of being villains. Not to mention the antagonists in the game appear completely out of nowhere, present no meaningful conflict with the main protagonist, and then disappear into obscurity once again. Several of these are written essentially as caricatures, harming the believability of the game's world. There's very little depth to these characters. They are there just to present an obstacle. A good villain has understandable motives. That's not the case here. If you look at the antagonists in Life is Strange 2, they're laughable at best and cringeworthy at worst.
It's America. We speak English.
The other characters aren't as bad. They are very stereotypical though.
Yeah, go hide in your dad's garage.
He can be saved.
You guys don't even have a Santa.
I'm kind of an online...
How do you say, I'm a dirty...
Well, let's go inside.
Our house while we're at church?
This ain't your business.
I thought my sculptures were shit too.
Try to be more eco-conscious.
One more issue is the lack of a significant romantic plot. You could only pursue a romantic interest in episode 3 alone, so it's not a lot of time to get invested into it. Unfortunately, the two characters you could get involved with aren't anything special. Cassie is just a person afraid of responsibility, and Finn, aside from being kind of an egoist, has a weird attitude. They're not bad, but just as about anything about the game, they're not very good or special either. The romantic plot in the prequels garnered a lot of attention and interest. In Life is Strange 2, it's sort of checked off and thrown away.
Right.
The game's plot's ultimate goal is to escape to Mexico, which is a very vague aim, seeing as there's little meaning behind it. Also, there doesn't seem to be much connection between individual episodes and reaching that goal, so it doesn't feel like we're working towards achieving something greater. We just sort of move from place to place, staying there for a time, and then move forward when we're forced to do so. On top of that, the plot has absolutely no player's involvement, and no matter our choices, we'll still start and end episodes in the same place and in the same way. The only thing we have influence over is the fate of other characters, but it's safe to say that the rules determining their fate seem rather random. We can save Finn, but in order to do so, we have to navigate through a labyrinth of fairly similar choices to finally choose the right sequence. It doesn't matter what we did before, it just matters whether or not we choose the right sequence of decisions during the confrontation. Chris's fate is also determined by us, but it's done so without the player being conscious about it. Due to that, the final outcome feels unearned. I do however have to say that at least the ending is determined by our choices concerning Daniel, which is an improvement over the game's two prequels, where the ending was just a static choice.
Fine. Whatever.
I didn't know if I would address this problem, but it does seem too important to pass up. A deep flaw, in my opinion, is the excessive politicization of the game's story, and that comes with conjunction with the game's plot being tailored specifically towards an American audience. In my case, I absolutely hated the politics present in the game, even though I agree with a lot of what was argued. It just felt forced and more like propaganda, not to mention it seemed to be completely unnecessary, the game's story. Throughout the whole game, the events feel forced, just for the sake of delivering a specific message. Furthermore, the characters themselves will be specifically tailored to suit a certain point of view, instead of being an actual representation of the character's values. This upon all hurts the game's world's credibility, making the characters essentially into message delivers, instead of being representations of fully formed individuals. It just goes to further harm the believability of the game's characters. My conclusion is, don't bring your political views into something that is used as a refuge from the real world, or if you have to, don't do it so blatantly. Those who already agree with you won't be affected, and you'll only end up irritating those who don't. Blatant political pandering doesn't bring anything of value to the game.
Whoa. I should have gone through that flash drive weeks ago.
Gameplay-wise, the game is boring, there's no other way to describe it. The lack of a player character controlled power limits our options of interacting with the world and takes a lot of fun from it. Also, a great deal of time in game is spent walking from place to place, without an actual objective in mind. This is especially true of episode 1, where the game turns into an actual walking simulator. Exploration and object interaction could be fun, but it doesn't reward the player in any meaningful way, making it obsolete. You could find and pick up souvenirs, which only have a cosmetic effect, which I guess is a nice touch if you care about this sort of stuff. It also seems some parts of gameplay were ditched during game development, like how money was set up in episode 1 to play a major role, but wasn't actually used outside of it.
Here.
The game also got rid of the phone, which I guess was a consequence of the new setting and storyline, but I still very much enjoyed it in the previous editions, as it was somewhat of an original way to interact with and get to know the characters. I really like that in BTS interacting with every object would eventually pay off, as in some cases you'd learn something and use in dialogue later, or you could come across some minor decision to make. Life is Strange 2 didn't capitalize on this, and even if you unlocked some new dialogue from object interaction, it makes no difference, either offering you some new piece of information which you really don't need, or quite literally making no difference at all. Last thing, the game's cutscenes were way too long, and this is especially true of those where the player doesn't have any control over the scene. It just felt unnecessary to have so much time in game spent on watching it, without any opportunity to add to or decide something in the scene.
We don't want to look like total pigs.
In conclusion, I think that the game developers tried too hard to step away from some of the major elements of the previous games, and it changed the game on a fundamental level. The static setting and day-to-day game pacing was replaced with a road trip that transformed those elements into an ever-changing environment. That, however, required major components of the game to be completely dropped, and without finding the appropriate replacement, the game overall lost in the value of the content. The game is almost solely concentrated on the two main characters, so if you dislike them, there isn't a lot for the options to enjoy it. And generally speaking, it might be hard to like them, be it for the generic character of Sean or Daniel being a concealed plot device. The gameplay really isn't something interesting. I think it's what you'd expect from a story-based, telltale type game, but there really wasn't any flavor to it. The devs gave the player some objects and characters to interact with, added some very long cutscenes, while at the same time taking away the feature of player character control power. I know gameplay isn't a strong suit of storytelling games, but Life is Strange 2 just butchered it completely. Overall, Life is Strange 2 is an improvement of the graphics, especially facial expressions, which is of major importance for games that emphasize story and characters. It's also nice to see that the ending is finally determined by our past actions, unlike in the previous editions. Also, the theme music was great as always. I didn't find the game to be extremely bad, but at the same time, there wasn't anything special about it. It goes without saying that the game's previous editions had their problems, but they also had some redeeming qualities, which overall made them enjoyable. Life is Strange 2 was just too generic. Bruh. This is more of an observation, but I believe it proves a point. If you look at the more active fan community of Life is Strange in general, you'd notice that the art or topics presented still very much favor the first two games of the series. It goes to show that Life is Strange 2 didn't quite strike a chord, even with the fans of the series. Ultimately, Life is Strange 2 is a very individual experience and a very polarizing one at that. If you got to play the game, I hope you enjoyed it. If not, then I hope you could resonate with the arguments I stated for why it wasn't so. Thanks for watching.
Case closed.